We are quickly coming up to the crescendo of spooky season with Halloween and All Saints Day or All Souls Day, Samhain. I don't think that I'm saying that correctly, but all these different festivals and celebrations of what lies beyond this life. And with that in mind, I have just finished a book called Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, and I'm going to have a review of that coming up as after this video gets published, probably the day after, maybe 2 days after, depending on when things actually get done and published. But I also thought it would be interesting and fun to repost an episode that I had originally recorded in August of 2020. And this episode of Ponder and Practice that was recorded in 2020 was with Georgie Dwiggins, who was sharing information about being a death doula. She had completed some training, and we had a really interesting conversation about everything that goes into that, and a little bit about her story and history with death, which is super interesting, and some of mine, which is less interesting, but nevertheless exists. And we talked about what it means to be a death doula, grief, all of the interesting things that go along this process, and there's this intermingle that happens with logistics and the emotional toll and all the things that have to be done when someone passes. And so I thought that I would share it because this is the time of this sort of thing. It's not like a super fun, spooky thing, but it is pretty practical and pretty interesting, in my opinion. So with all of that said, it is an old episode. The audio is questionable at times, to say the least. I edited it at the time, and I've gone back through and re-edited it, so hopefully it's better. But if there is some volume issue and some sound quality issue, that's why, because it's very old and I didn't know what I was doing. I still don't know what I'm doing, but hopefully know a little bit more. The other thing is that we do also talk in this episode about death with dignity. And this is a topic and a concept that at the time of this recording, I had different feelings about than I do now. At the time of this recording, I was more open to the concept, and my opinions over the years have changed, particularly with some things that are going on in different places in the world and the criteria for that being decreased. So, just so you're aware of that, opinions may have changed over the years. The last thing that logistically is important to know before you get into this episode is that there is one word that I have censored for YouTube. So I will probably put a heading on the screen when that comes up so that you can see it, but it is the word where someone decides to no longer participate in this life and takes themselves out of the game. But otherwise, I hope that you enjoy this episode. Hey there, friends, and welcome to another episode of Ponder and Practice. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so happy that you're here. It is with a colleague of mine, Georgie Dwiggins, and she and I used to work at the same clinic together, and she is transitioning her work into working as a death doula. So if you don't know what a death doula is, essentially it's someone who helps people as they transition from this life into whatever comes after. And we get into all of the ins and outs of what that means, what it looks like, and the different roles and responsibilities of someone who has taken on the role of being a death doula. And we have a really beautiful and frank conversation about death and about what it means to grieve for someone who has passed away, and also what it looks like to bear witness to someone who is in the process of dying. I also do want to let you know that we get into some of the rules and regulations around different kinds of things like advanced directives, death with dignity, or physician-assisted these kinds of things. Every state has different rules, so you're going to want to check in if any of these issues apply to you, or if you're curious about different things. If you want to set up your own advanced directive, you're going to need to get in touch with an attorney who is familiar with whatever the rules are and the laws are where you are located. Additionally, some states are in the process or have already put into place electronic infrastructure so that if you have a PULST, which is is physician order for life-sustaining treatment or life-saving treatment, that this is accessible no matter where you go seek care in that state or jurisdiction. So some states have it, some states don't. We talk about having multiple copies of this kind of paperwork so that you can access it if you need it, or someone close to you can access it if they need it. And certainly all of these options are good, but again, you're going to want to check in and see what the rules are, what the resources that are available in your particular space are. The last thing I just want to give you a caveat before I get into this is we had some really big technical issues, so I edited it as best as I could. That said, the sound in some places is a little raw, so just be aware of that. I've done my best. I apologize. There are some sounds I couldn't really get rid of. Without further ado, I hope that you enjoy this conversation with Georgie Dwiggins. Hi, Georgie. Thanks for joining me today.
Absolutely.
So for folks who don't know, which is most people, we met way back when I was precepting with a doctor at the clinic where you work.
Yes.
And I always felt so dumb because I didn't know anything about anything. And you were like, oh no, it's fine. Like, I will help you. And I really...
Yeah, there's a lot I didn't know too, so we figured it out.
Yeah, and then we became better acquainted because I worked more intensely, like, at the clinic as a doctor once I graduated, and, you know, we hung out on some long days. And so it's been a pleasure getting to know you. You have a really interesting, your way of being is very in line with my way of being and tend to be very sort of heart-centered, calm, easygoing, which I always value in folks. And over the course of our relationship, I have learned that you have a very interesting career path unfolding ahead of you. So for everyone, tell us about that.
Sure. So yes, just want to start out, it has been great being able to have these conversations with you in the office and just having somebody who is also interested in kind of the more nuanced ways of healing or ways of being and handling emotions. And what I'm wanting to go into, that dying is, you know, a natural part of the human experience, and if we can help to educate people about what that looks like and being more comfortable talking about this topic and trying to kind of avoid some of the chaos or heightened emotions that can be present at that time. So I found this work, I would say I was invited to something, I think the event was called Death on Tap, and it was all about preparing advanced directives, and so it was just an informal kind of gathering. And that was the first time I'd really heard the term, you know, Death Doula and of Life Doula, and it was put on by a collective of women here in Portland. So that kind of piqued my interest, and I reached out to one of the women and had tea a couple times, learned a little bit more, and found a training through, there are a few out there, but the one that I landed on is through INELDA, and so it's the International Association of End of Life Doula Association. And so I just actually this morning completed my 4-course training in that, and have learned, you know, a little bit more in depth and do definitely feel called to be of service in this way.
Mm. So for folks who don't know what a doula is, how would you explain that? And doulas show up around birth and doulas show up around death.
Right, and that is something kind of the jumping off point, they say, you know, because it is a newer kind of emerging field that people may not be quite as familiar with, and that is one of the suggestions that was given in my training, is to ask people first, you know, well, have you heard of a birth doula? It's a little more common. People are a little bit more comfortable with that. And then you say, okay, well, you know, it's a similar process, but for death. Mm-hmm. So any of the activities or offerings that would be there would be being there for legacy work. Mm-hmm. So to help people who ideally you would start meeting with a client with a few months prior to the actual event of death. So you could get to know them and get to know their family and really start to think about what this person's life has meant and what are some ways that we can honor that. So whether it's through creating books of memories or some sort of visual project, also bringing in the idea of education as far as what the death process actually looks like for the family. So, you know, for a lot of people, it's a scary thing. We don't talk about it in our society that much, and people aren't necessarily aware of what it kind of looks like in those final moments. So being there as a witness and someone to kind of walk the family through this process and assure them, no, that is normal, it's okay. So to fill this kind of gap in care is the phrase that the founder used. You're not the social worker, you're not the therapist, but you're not part of the family, you're not part of the medical team, but there's this person who's here to kind of walk the people through the process and to help ensure that the dying person's wishes are met. So there can be planning of the vigil. How do they want the room to look? Do they want there to be certain smells or sounds that are soothing or comforting? Who do they actually want in the room? Do they want any sort of ritual performed? And whether they are of a particular religion or spirituality, that it's what are they wanting in those final moments, and how can you help be an advocate for that? I think that's a really important process of it as well. And the idea of being there for the work through their grief and understand grief. And so really, being there from the planning until the end and being a constant source of information and comfort.
It really makes a big difference. My experience with death, I had my grandmother died when I finished the 8th grade. My grandfather died when I finished the 9th grade. My mom's spouse died when I was a senior in high school. And so it was like this period of guess what we're doing right now, Catherine? Just one after the next after the next.
Right.
And I remember during that time, obviously death doulas are not a good fit for sudden death, right? It's really if someone has cancer, if they have a terminal illness of some sort, it's coming. You have some lead time to get some supports in place. It was interesting growing up around so much death, because that time between 12 and 18, those are formative years.
So formative, right?
And so seeing hospice come in, having nurses, and then I was not with any of my family members when they passed. My mom was with all of them, and she wouldn't call herself a death doula, but she took on supporting one of her friends through death as well in her home, and so has also filled that role, although she doesn't realize it.
Right.
But hearing her sit with folks who have died, and that moment of transition, we can get super philosophical and into it, but there's this, right at the moment of birth, spirit coming into the world, and you can argue about when exactly that happens, conception, etc., etc. But then at death, there's the opposite happening, right? There's a spirit leaving the world. And whether or not you conceptualize of spirit or the afterlife, whatever it is, the objective fact is that someone who was once up and moving no longer is doing that. So how do you, can you talk folks through, just for educational processes, what is the process of death from your training and experience?
Sure. So I would say, obviously, right, in an ideal situation, you're able to come in months before and really kind of get to know this person. And because even some of those earlier signs and symptoms that death is coming, obviously, those can even happen months prior. But I think there are situations where, someone is kind of brought in at that last second, and you can kind of implement whatever tools are possible. And I think that's been the main thing I've come away with this is you have all these tools, and you're able to use them in different ways with different families and different situations for different people. So as far as the dying process itself goes, however, even 1 to 3 months before the act of dying, there can be kind of, hints or things that might lead you to believe okay, maybe it's time to start this process. People start to really engage less with the world around them and start to kind of draw inward, less energy, not doing as many daily activities, just kind of finding that their world is getting smaller and smaller. And obviously that's in some cases. One really great quote out of this was, there's a myriad of ways to leave the human body. So, you know, there can be disease. It can be sudden. It can be drawn out. You can think it's the end and then pulled back through. And so this idea that being flexible with it, it's never going to look one exact way. So even though there are these kind of, telltale signs, remaining open to the fact that, it's life and it's different and it's messy and everyone's experience is going to be different. And so leaving room for that, I think, is really important, because you never want to promise the family, like, oh, they did this one thing, that means they have X amount of time. That's not the way the world works, and that's not the way that death works. So even, moving into more, people start to maybe a few weeks before, typically, becoming a little more disoriented and confused or agitated. What I really thought was great, also being able to recognize these physical symptoms that, again, can maybe look scary, or, because we don't think about the reality of death. We see it in movies or films or whatever, because just culturally it's not something that we really want to put ourselves at a front seat witness to. So again, there can be some modeling or mobilization of skin, secretions or fevers, people just kind of going through these natural processes of the body shutting down, but can be kind of shocking, and this idea of even that the death rattle or the breathing, we come into this world in a very rhythmic kind of breathing pattern. And, at the end of life, it gets very jagged and almost mechanical and unnatural kind of looking. And I think, being, and then people wanting to help to provide some respite from that, not understanding that is just what's happening in the body, and that's okay. So I think those would be some main, as far as the active process. Yep. So, in those final moments, if you're hearing that death rattle, that it actually means that they're really, really relaxed, because their soft palate has started to close down. And even if they're not able to swallow and they have very open mouth breathing, that's the body relaxing. So, and again, it's something that I think people don't think about. And if we were just to say, yeah, just you cry, and these things, so it doesn't feel like such a, big, scary thing for people to bear witness to. I mean, it's something that I think culturally, and in some cultures obviously still happen. It's that it is this beautiful, amazing ceremony and rite of passage, and just, again, part of the human experience. And I think if we can start to reframe that and think about it in a little bit more of those terms, that it can become something really celebratory at that moment, and reflecting. And obviously there's sorrow and pain, and like you said, it's someone who was there and wasn't, and helping people kind of enter this new reality that they're faced with when that happens, is maybe a little bit easier if they understand how it goes along the process.
Yeah, it's so weird. And I know you have some interesting stories of death in your own life. Are you comfortable sharing some of those?
Yeah, I was thinking, when because I know you and I obviously have had some wonderful candid conversations, and I think I've thought about that, and I think what I keep coming back to is being authentic, and like you were saying, why, working with these parts of yourself and integrating your story and things that have happened to you to maybe what led you to this point. And I don't know that, in my business and on my website that I'll share all of this, that memories and life experiences and traumas and things are kind of speak to as well. And so I do think that it's formative, right? So I was a twin, and my twin was born stillborn. And to this day, we don't really know exactly why or what happened. She was carried full term with me. And so I feel like I started out my life with hand in hand with death, right? And so in some ways that has sparked this interest or has had, has captivated me in that way. Just thinking that it's something that's like in my cells on some level, And so I think that is a really big reason why I'm called to do this work. And the other more personal thing, and again, I'm fine with sharing because I do think I keep coming back to the why, and I can't say that this probably isn't part of it. My grandparents, who I did not know before I was born a couple of years before, both were sick with cancer and were very in love. And I believe one of them received a terminal diagnosis, and they were both in a lot of pain and, knew it would be like a long, drawn out, hard process with lots of emotion and lots of just turmoil. And so made the decision, from, and this is all passed down to me about 8, and asked the questions and received the questions, or answers rather, to these. And they decided to commit suicide. And I think, I live in Oregon now, and I've learned about California and this idea of death with dignity. It is an autonomous thing. And I think that on some level, that knowing that information and knowing that they felt like they had some sense of control at the end of life and some sense of, knowing how the book was going to go, and they laid out their will and they had all the paperwork together, and, even at the planning of it, and being able to leave something that wasn't so, oh, well, what do we do now? Or, that chaos and that emotion, it just, obviously there was emotion, but it was managed in a way that it was very kind of straightforward, what they wanted, their wishes, all the plans. And, that then you're not having to deal with all those decisions. And I think that's part of this work too. And just thinking about, going forward, what that can look like for people. The other main, or two other main situations that kind of informed my work with this, my very, very good friend, who I've known since I was a child, and she and I are basically like sisters. We don't have sisters of our own, and she received a heart transplant. And I had just a few weeks prior taken this course on advanced directives and things. And so then I flew down, I was in the hospital with her and in California. And it's funny, after taking this training and this course, I've called her after almost every single class and just been like, that's what I did for you. Like, this is what we did. And so, this idea of creating a sense of personalization and home in a hospital room, and bringing in the flowers and the photos and the mementos and the items and the objects that mean something to this person, and creating that space that is soothing, and strengthening for them. And, that was a whole class. And that's all I did when I was down there. And, helping, being that person to communicate with the doctors and the nurses when she couldn't necessarily advocate for herself. Yeah. I felt very on in that moment. And like, I'm here, I'm helping someone, I'm providing the care, I'm doing the deep listening. And it just felt so right for me. Mm-hmm. And so I called her yesterday was her birthday, and just poured out my heart. Is just how great. Well, I know that was obviously a huge undertaking experience for her, but just the gratitude that for me to be able to walk through with somebody that means that much to me, and to learn from that situation, just what a gift that was for me as well. And similarly, when I was a senior in college, my father had a very traumatic brain injury, and I flew home from New York City to North Carolina and stayed in the neurointensive ICU for a little over 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. But just was fascinated with it, and watching. I think in a way it helped me deal, to think like, oh, it's interesting and it's science and it's this, and separate a little bit, but also just that idea of like, here's this person that I know so well. In some moments he would remember, and others he wouldn't. Mm-hmm. And then, having to get together financial things and be the one to talk to the doctors again, and just the advocacy, and it being somebody that I cared for so much, really just made me feel like this is what I'm here to do, mm-hmm. And I'm here to offer these ideas of, ceremony. And I've always had an interest in I took many classes in college around like American Indian art and civilization, or Indian art and culture, and just the ritual through in these different ways. And so again, these experiences, I think, have just really solidified for me that I've always wanted to help in some way, and I love being there for people. And I think that given those experiences early on, it's a very particular time and a really rich time to be there for someone in that way. And, I'm excited, honestly, just so excited about it. So.
Mm-hmm. That's a good word, rich. It is a very rich time. Talk to me about, because I was going to say there's nothing like the grief process. It just is one of those things, like if you let it, and this comes down to like you have to let grief happen. If you try to push it away or pretend that it's not there or make it better or smooth it over or like anything else, it's going to be way rougher than, which is counterintuitive, because if you let it happen, it's a whole body process. Like it is gripping in a way that nothing else is. Like, and just, I know that in my intense moments of grieving, it's like every cell in my body is just like tense and holding. And then at some point, like it starts to move and release, but it's like, it is bizarre, man.
Yeah. New experiences for sure. Yeah.
So can you talk to us about what is the grieving process, which may sound like a dumb question, but what's happening when we're grieving, and how do you, it's a two-parter, and how do you move gracefully through grief, if that's possible at all?
Well, I think keeping, again, that kind of flexibility and open mind that it's going to look different for different people. And obviously, like, a lot of that is based on their relationship with the person, who that person was in their life. Was there any sort of unfinished emotion? And then what does that look like, working through those? And I think this idea thrown around, not this in the worst set, that you can cycle through, being angry, being sad, being just depressed where you don't want to move, to where it does become physical, to one day just wanting to talk about the person and tell all those stories. And then, 2 seconds later, you could be in a pit of this. So allowing yourself to recognize it doesn't have to look one certain way, and it's not going to look one certain way. And then, giving yourself permission to not have to dictate what it's going to look like, I think is the most graceful thing, and understanding that it is this weird liminal space that, you're no longer who you were before this happened, but you're not yet who you're going to be on the other side of it, and recognizing that you're kind of in the thick of it, in the midst of grief. And that's its own place, its own thing. And so, obviously there are things that can be helpful, for like retelling that dying story and what happened and what you felt like did honor the person and what went well, and kind of, and then if there are things that maybe didn't, or you wish that would have been differently, voicing those, and then thinking, okay, is there a way that we can repair it? Is there a letter you could write and not send? Is there some sort of, thing you could do to honor in a way that then you can accept what did happen, and allowing yourself to, to have the space to make it, again, it's not going to be right and done and over, but to be able to carry on with your life and continue to do meaningful activities. And the other thing I think to recognize is, grief can be long, and it can maybe never totally go away. And that is also okay. There isn't this idea of being healed or cured from grief. It's something deep. It's a deep loss. And, to honor that. And it could be years down the road and you see, something or hear something that reminds you of this person, and that grief is still there and it can come flooding back, and allow yourself the space to feel that and to have that emotion and then continue on. So I think not putting any sort of like timeline or requirements or anything, but allowing yourself space is really just how to find that grace in grief.
Yeah. I never thought about it before as like you're a different person. It's like being an adolescent. Like you're not a kid, but you're not an adult yet. I never have conceptualized of it in that way, and that's a really helpful image to hold of like it's a transition that's happening and it's a big change. Yeah,
definitely. And I do want to say, like, you know, I'm kind of flipping through my notes from the class. Like, a lot of this was given to me in this language, and you know, and how to think about things, and it's a lot of stuff that I hadn't necessarily considered either. You know, this isn't stuff that I was necessarily aware of before. And, you know, I just have pages and pages here that now that this training is finished, I'm really excited to kind of go back through and pick out those parts like that really, I think are very simple, helpful ways to frame this process for people. And I think that's some of the gems that I've really been given, and just like really concise ways of explaining the big, to really just give ourselves the space and understanding of the process.
Yeah. What sorts of we've talked a little bit about tools to like provide support to the person who is in the process of dying, in addition to providing support and like kind of aftercare once that transition has happened. Can you talk more specifically about what those tools are, what they look like, how and when they might be used?
Yeah. So I think one of the main tools, you know, we're given at this time is this idea of deep active listening is one of the kind of like cornerstones of this work. And so this idea that you are, again, there as a witness to this process. And so I guess this could go for the family or for the dying person. I'll speak specifically to the dying person, but, you know, if they have emotional things that they kind of want to work through before, you know, their time is up, being there and just holding the space for them to kind of explore their emotional landscape and asking, you know, open-ended questions, you know, like what life choices have changed your course? And if they say something about that, you know, it's, then you're just saying, well, can you tell me more? Can you give me an example? And this idea that you're making meaning for their life. And, you know, because everyone has accomplishments or things that they've done, and that you're really exploring, you know, summing up and kind of meaning making. So that idea of active listening and really going in and hearing them and just bearing witness to their story and having that humbling experience of allowing them to kind of review and take stock. So that would be one, is kind of that active listening. So the second tool, I would say, guided visualization, guided imagery. And I know this is something you and I have kind of spoken about before, is this idea of like, you know, things that might be considered like a little more out there or, you know, out of left field, but then kind of backing it up with, well, these are the research behind it. And this is kind of like melding of these more like, you know, spirituality and science-based things and kind of where they can come together. So the guided imagery is really helpful because if somebody is feeling, you know, very agitated or scared or, you know, any of these emotions they could be feeling at this time, helping them to return to a place and sense of peace. And so maybe asking them, you know, where is somewhere that you feel really just, you know, calm and your best self and relaxed, and what's a peaceful place? And obviously a lot of times, you know, it's somewhere in nature, or somewhere that they visited as a child, or any of these things, and really gathering information, you know, so what, like very rich descriptions, and you can even, you know, work with their memories and what are they imagining there? Like there really are no rules with it, and allowing yourself to help describe somewhere. And for me, this really came up like, it's almost like writing or like a poem or telling them a story, and really trying to get all those details in and bringing them to a place, guiding them through imagining themselves in that place. And with this, they've seen, a lowered blood pressure or less agitation, or maybe there's not as much of a need for certain medications because they're feeling calm and they're actually feeling that in their body, and you can see them kind of smile or laugh or just relax a little bit. So I think that is a really, really great tool that I'm excited to kind of start to practice. And then in that process, you're learning more about this person and you're able to kind of personalize this whole thing for them. So I'd say those are two really, really great tools. The other, this idea of a legacy project. So if, say there's somebody who really liked to cook with their family, that maybe you're creating a recipe book that then the family can use and reflect on later, or maybe it is collecting all of their photos from their travels, and then it's right there in the room for the family to talk to them, to pour over, and to have these stories. So creating kind of physical things in a physical environment that fosters this sense of reflection and peace and kind of reminiscing, I think is really, really helpful, and something that, could bring such a sense of community and reflection during an end of life.
Yeah. Obviously, families are complicated, and I'm curious if part of the work that you do is facilitating some of those more challenging conversations that might need to happen, is the wrong word, help to bring kind of closure, to help bring meaning and close those emotional loops, as it were. If, there's been some sort of bad blood or disagreement or whatever it is that part of the work that you do, helping folks kind of come to truce, connection, like reestablishing those connections? I'm asking this in a really bad way, but I'm hoping that you understand what I'm getting at.
I think before that kind of piece of it comes, I think part of the work as far as navigating those familial relationships or difficulties, part of this work is really being an advocate for the person who is dying and ensuring that their wishes are carried out. Obviously you can do this work as part of a team or in a care center or whatever, but at the end of the day, you are hired by this person to do this thing. So there were some examples given to me, where somebody was very explicit about who they wanted in the room when they were actively dying, and there was someone in the family that they felt that it would be a stressful situation for them, and that person, said, "Oh, well, I want to be there. We can reconcile, and that's fine." And the doula had to be the one to step in and just say, "Listen, I feel for you. I understand that." Again, coming from, an open heart space, but that this is not their wishes, or this is not how they wanted it to be. And, that is what I'm going to honor and be there for. So in a way, I think you're kind of helping navigate those conversations, because then it doesn't become family members having to be the ones to figure that out and to argue about it, to say, it's a very clear thing, this is what they wanted. So to start, you're kind of nipping that in the bud a little bit. Obviously there might be some heightened emotions and still some issues there, but it's not as much family to family if there's somebody delegated to be the gatekeeper, so to speak, in that way. And then afterwards, I think because we are being educated on the different ways people grieve and that it can look different ways, because you kind of have that knowledge and that working dialogue of what that could look like, you're able to, say there's somebody who really, really shuts down afterwards and somebody's really upset, why don't they care more? Or why weren't they more helpful? Why couldn't they have done this? And there's a lot of animosity or, like you said, bad blood in that situation. Then you're there to help remind that person, to explain, that everyone kind of handles this in a different way, and that just might be their grieving process. So the other idea with this is you never want to, you're not trying to overstep into anyone else's kind of work. So if there does need to be a referral to a therapist or a social worker or a grief counselor, if you feel that there's something that is kind of beyond the scope of what you're trained to do, really having a good idea of building those networks and being able to support other professions that are kind of, you know, in this work by proxy. Yeah. So I think that's, you know, you never want to jump in and say, oh yeah, I can help you guys, like as a family counselor or anything like that. You can offer your knowledge. And I think it's really important to know like when to kind of step back. And that was a very big kind of takeaway for me, is like, it's really, you can come in and be part of this team and that you're all there to support this person through the process. And so knowing when to delegate, I think, is important as well.
Yeah. So, and that brings me to my next question, which is, there are a lot of logistics associated with death. And we talked a little bit about the paperwork that's involved. I used to work at a bank, and anytime anybody came in with a death certificate, it was like, oh gosh, this is going to take like the entire day, because the logistics are phenomenal. As another random example, like my mom still gets messages and like phone bills for her partner who died, you know, in 2005. It's been 15 years and like this stuff still shows up, and it's just like, what is happening? Wow. And I know now it's like social media has complicated things. Can you talk to us about like what are all of the logistics that you're aware of, and like how do you, and we don't have to talk about like the pulse stuff necessarily, I'll do like an addendum after the episode about that, but like what's your working knowledge of like how to potentially set things up? Where are you directing families to go to get support on that? Do you do any specific work with the person who's dying in terms of like logistical stuff? I mean, the Legacy Project is kind of part of that, but I'm curious what other tools that you might have, or like referrals that are, you know, like, yep, you're going to this person, like, yep, you need to go see this person. An attorney comes to mind.
But logistics. I think, right. So I would suggest, and I mean, I've thought about this, obviously, you know, part of this class, it's like, oh gosh, I don't have any of this. Like, I need to do these things. And I think that's the thing, is like, we have this idea that, oh, you know, when I'm in my 50s or my 40s or, you know, later on, that maybe I'll get there. But, you know, there's no reason not to have it now. And it's, you know, talking about it or being prepared, like, it doesn't make it happen. And it just means it's there, you know. And so I would suggest, and I need to do this for myself, I have my own checklist going here as well, but I would say advance directive is important to have, and that, you know, just in the case that you are not able to advocate for yourself, having those wishes written down in a place, as far as medically what you would and wouldn't want done in that situation, and appointing someone to be your healthcare advocate. It's called an advocate some places, a proxy in others. That's the other thing to keep in mind, is all this varies from state to state, sometimes kind of widely. So I think knowing what the rules and logistics and laws are in your particular area is really important, because it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. So researching your own state's advance directive and having someone who can advocate for you in the case that you're not, and ensure that that is carried out, is really important. And you want to make sure that it's someone who would be able to, you know, go to bat for you and be able to talk to doctors or family members and really kind of stand their ground as far as this is what is, you know, wished for, required. I think, and then having them know having multiple copies of that. And having it very clear where those are, because, you know, there's no good in having one if nobody can read it or get to it to read. So something interesting I was reading the other day is people are starting to like record a video on their phone of just them speaking and just saying, you know, this is what I want to happen in this case. And then it's this, you know, it's literally from the person's mouth, and it's there for reference. And then, you know, that's something obviously most of us constantly will have our phones with us, so it's with you in case something were to happen and you necessarily weren't at home or it was unexpected. So I think that's a really interesting and useful practice for maybe us to start to get in the habit of doing. And I do know, you know, after the act of death has happened, that thing of I think 10 is the magic number that I've heard floating around as far as having 10 death certificates, because there are so many logistical things at the end. And as far as that with the grieving process, that was something that was brought up is, in those first 2 to 4 weeks after a death, there's really not a lot of, and again, everything's different, but not a lot of active grieving, because you're just kind of in this like get stuff done mode, and like tying up the bank accounts and making sure, things are notarized and all of those logistics. So it is something that I feel like I want to be more of a source of information on, but I don't, again, because it's such a legality thing as well. So I think, being really, really clear on what is required in your particular area. And that's something that is on my research to-do list for Oregon and our surrounding states here. Because I think there are so many things that people don't realize or don't think about. And obviously the more that can be done prior, the less kind of chaotic and distressing everything is going to be at the end.
Yeah.
So any of that can be mitigated prior, I'm in my late 20s, and it's like, it's not something I really thought about, but that doesn't, just because you're of a certain age or you're in great health or any of these things, there's no really good reason not to have this information prepared.
Yeah. And just for folks who don't know, an advance directive will walk through, and you talked about this a little bit, Georgie, but just to clarify, it'll walk through, if you want, quote unquote, heroic measures. So this is like if you're in a state where your survival is unlikely for whatever reason. So like if there's an accident, if you have a terminal illness that progresses to a certain point, these are heroic measures, or things like ventilators, feeding tubes, that will keep your body alive, sort of in the most dire of circumstances. And then they also specify, of course, like always, comfort and cleanliness and hygiene are included as part of medical care. And so this, I want to also touch on death with dignity before we go, but this is part of like, even if you are terminally ill or you are comatose, unconscious, like your team is required to treat your body and your being with care and dignity as a human being. And so that is sort of baseline. No matter what, you will get those things. And then the advance directive will also say, like you said, like who's going to speak for you. And then it walks through, depending on the form that you have, it'll walk through a couple different situations so you can kind of decide, and it's graded by severity of illness and likelihood of recovery. So it'll walk through, like, if it's this bad, do you want anything? If it's a little bit less bad, do you want anything? Do you want a feeding tube but not a ventilator, right? So like if you can't breathe, do you want to be kept alive? But, if you can breathe but you can't eat, like, is that okay? So you can pretty specifically spell out what is or is not acceptable to you as a potential patient in these situations.
Right. And I think that's it's just kind of to ease confusion and, because even in a hospital and going through this, with my friend and my father, it can get very chaotic, and everybody is kind of in this heightened state, and like doctors and nurses included, there are so many things going on that they're taking care of in their day. And I think, again, just the clearer that this can be, that you can look at this document and say like, oh, well, this is what we're doing, not to sound cold about it, but just to give the straightforward plan in those situations is just such a helpful resource.
Yeah, it really is. And it's oddly empowering.
Right.
I was filling mine out and I was like, oh, I can do that? Oh, I can decide about that? And I was like, oh, okay, like, I obviously don't want anything bad to happen to myself or to my husband, but like, all right,
yeah.
feel a little bit better should anything come up.
If you can just get yourself in like a headspace of, I'm going to be thinking about these things and just setting aside some time and really like, knowing you don't have to sit there and stew in it for days and days, but just like, all right, and really, I think they're just great internal questions to think about in general and kind of put you in this place of like reflection. And I don't know, for me, even these things I've been being asked, it just makes you kind of appreciate, what you do have in your life. And I think that's the thing too, is like by becoming a little bit more aware and involved with the idea of death, it really does kind of heighten the sense of like, gratitude for being alive and being able to do these things when you're kind of reminding yourself that is a real thing that's there and a possibility. It makes everything else just that much more appreciated.
Yeah. I know, I feel like this is a Stoic thing in addition to a Buddhist practice of like sitting and meditating on your death. And both, like, what is it like? I think the Buddhists talk about like meditating on the, like, after you've died, like, what is that existence? And then for Stoicism, it comes, because Stoic philosophy is all about like the practicalities and the pragmatism of life. So if you're coming from a Stoic standpoint, it's much more like, how am I preparing? How am I getting ready for that moment of death? And I think it does bear some reflecting in time. And again, like you said, you don't have to stew in this forever and ever, but taking a little bit of time to like journal out or meditate on, or like, think about it while you're going for a walk or talking with your spouse about, or a close friend or whoever, like, okay, well, my death is inevitable. What are the implications of that on my life?
Yeah, it's very humbling. And I think too, this idea of like quality of life, I mean, there's so many things now, and I originally kind of came to this, I was in a program also through Portland Community College in their gerontology, and this idea of like, care at the end and hospice and palliative care, and we just keep prolonging and prolonging, but it's kind of like, at what cost and at what quality of life? And if somebody is at that point where they are just in pain and they're not enjoying it. And I mean, I know currently my grandmother is in the, I don't know, mid to late stages of Alzheimer's, which is something that kind of brought me in. I've always had the interest in memory and story, and just kind of watching the process of my family navigating care for her, and then even just the cost of certain facilities and things like this. And she's even said, and again, when I'm kind of going through these, like, what are signs and symptoms, it's that turning inward and the saying, oh, I might not be here then, and I might not this. And I feel like if somebody has felt that they are appreciative and has lived this life, it's a time for reflection as well, and it does make you kind of appreciate and say, like, I guess I'm saying, in like drawing it out, and like we have this kind of obsession with staying alive and living, so long and all these things. And I think there's certain points where it's just like somebody might be ready to go, and that is okay.
There are two concepts that are relevant here, and one is, they go together. It's health span and lifespan. So health span is the amount of your life that you're like healthy and well and like contributing and able to be up and about. And your lifespan is the amount of time that you are alive. And so
I like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to consider when you're thinking about, like, if you are diagnosed with something, or, like in hospice, whatnot, and considering like, well.
I like health span versus lifespan a lot, though. That's a very useful kind of phrase. And I think, there's a difference, just kind of thinking back to my experiences, like, there's a difference in somebody who is told, who's towards the end of their life, or who's, definitely aging, and that is part of this process, and it's kind of this imminent thing, right? And versus, say, my friend who was 25, 26 when all that happened with her heart. And so that's different when you're thinking about, oh, there's still so much, there's still so much life to be lived. And it's like she hadn't even gotten started, kind of thing, And so I think even for her, though, meditating on what had been done so far in her life and where she was at, I mean, and then to come out of that experience and totally shake up her entire life, because she was faced with this, like, what is the quality of that I've done so far? And then, if it was to be done now, well, no, and So I think, yeah, in that way, it can be a very kind of catalyzing experience and helpful experience to think about it, even if you're not, given a diagnosis or anything like that, but just to really remind yourself of mortality. And I know that sounds kind of morbid, but and it's not like it's something every day I get up and I think, oh, I'm gonna die. But I think it, again, just kind of bringing it into the conversation and that it's a part of life, can help you kind of be in the here and now a little bit, in a more authentic and rich, to come back to our words, kind of way.
Yeah, for sure. So the other thing, because we touched on it really briefly before, and I wanted to just provide some additional information for folks who aren't familiar with the term death with dignity. Can you tell us about that and what that means?
So in my understanding, and again, this is one of those notes that it's like, oh, I want to go in and research and be expert. But from my understanding, it's essentially physician assisted. We want to use that term. But there are certain requirements. It's not just something you can say, yeah, that's what I want to do. And it's a process. And I recently was watching a webinar. It was based out of California, which is a little bit different, obviously, than Oregon, or other places as well. But, it's, if you've been given a prognosis of 6 months or less, and then you have to have that from 2 different physicians, and there has to be like counseling involved. So it is like an application process, but it's this idea that, terminal thing and you are in pain, and, you want to have that sense of control and decision as far as when the time is, that it is an option for people here in Oregon. A lot of times when people, speak to their physicians or care team or what have you, that if they're asking about a prognosis, that physicians, the majority of the time, and there's studies cited that I wanted to go back to, will nearly double what they actually think the person has to live, because they assume that, nobody wants to be told, oh, you have 2 weeks or whatever, so they actually will inflate that a little bit, in the hopes of comfort, I think. But also, one, if you're seeking this option, and 2, just in general for planning, I know that it might be difficult, but I think there is documentation and things that have to be done with that. That is my knowledge of it thus far, but it is obviously something that I, especially being here where it is an option of care, that I want to kind of acquaint myself with what that might exactly look like. Do you know much more about it, or?
No, that's also my understanding. For folks who, again, don't know what happens, so like all that documentation that you just talked about, Georgie, has to be in place, obviously. And then what happens, because physicians are bound by oath to do no harm.
Right.
And so physicians cannot be present when the person decides that they're ready to transition out of this life. And so what happens is that there are prescription meds that are given, and typically it's a pill format, and then the person can go pick those up, they take them home, they make whatever arrangements they want to make, and then it's really up to them when and where, in what context they make their transition. It's pretty controversial. I think it does require a really high degree of clarity and self-knowledge to be able to say decisively, like, okay, I've gotten this diagnosis, and it's too much. I don't want to have this experience.
Yeah, I think it is. It does all come back. I was just thinking as you were saying that, to just being really, really aware with what you want, and the reflection on your life, and kind of, are there loose ends? And these are all things you can be thinking about while you're still here, and it's not like, oh, I have to have some sort of diagnosis to be asking these questions. I think in general, that idea of being self-reflective and, clarity was a great word, I think, as far as like where you stand on all of this. And it's hard to come to these ideas if it's something that we're being avoidant about.
Yeah.
And I do think, especially, I was originally very hesitant in taking. This was supposed to be an in-person training for one weekend, and obviously due to everything happening in the world right now, it was online. And I originally thought that would be not the best, but I think in this climate, like everybody, it almost heightened the whole experience because everybody kind of is thinking about these things and mortality and things a little bit more. So it feels very potent right now. And I think I shared with you, the thing about why people, it was about why people grieve. And so obviously this was in the context of death in my class, but just, anytime that there's a world change or the future is unknown or your role in life is kind of shattered or your identity shaken, like these are all things that cause grief and that process of kind of like really intense feelings. And but it's been interesting doing this online, also seeing how this sort of work, I mean, because we practiced all these things with each other as far as with each other, the imagery and asking these deep questions, and this kind of proof that there's still such a need for that emotional connection and that some of it can be done virtually. And there's all these conversations like, what does this look like? I can't go and volunteer with hospice right now. So maybe part of the work for this right now is just the education and, helping people think about these questions that are coming up right now, just as far as, what does end of life care look like? What do I need to have in place? What do I want it to look like? And so I think it's been a very, very interesting time to be diving into this work and has made it just seem so much more timely, for sure.
Yeah. I just remembered a question I had intended to ask you earlier.
Sure.
Are death doulas like on call like a birth doula would be?
Yeah. So I think, ideally, like you've already formed this relationship with the family and everything, and then you are on call for when they, if you are needing to be there during that very active dying, like during those last moments. I think you are pretty much on call for that. But again, because it is kind of an emerging field, it can kind of, you can structure it in different ways, right? So are you saying, I'm going to come every week and we're going to work on the legacy project and we're going to do that? Or are you like, I'm going to check in with the family in a group meeting once a month and we'll kind of talk about care and then I'll go spend time with the person. And so again, that idea that it is about how you can best serve. And so, maybe and working out that contract or, kind of framework with the family prior to let them know exactly what you are and aren't offering. And again, what kind of tools are at the disposal and what they need help with, might need help with. And for some people, it might be more of the planning and the advanced directive and those logistical things. And other people might want you to help, create like a really, really beautiful space. And some people might want you there in that last moment. And some people might decide that they want you to kind of help plan it and everything. And then that is for the family. I've heard a lot of doulas then being invited to the funeral or then, even months after doing reprocessing work with the family after that person is gone. So I think it's at kind of the discretion of whoever you're working with, and just knowing like these are the things that you can offer them and then understanding what might be most helpful. But if they, do want you there, then I think, you can agree to kind of jump in as needed.
Yeah. That's so cool.
Death is just part of life. Like, and, we have these, I really love the word ritual. And it's like, we have these rituals for milestones or birthdays or when someone comes into the world or, when we gather in certain ways in community. And this is so ancient, this idea, and I mentioned other cultures and things, and I think being respectful and, not stepping in places that maybe aren't your space, but to understand that this is something that humans have been doing since the beginning of time, and it used to be a very public thing. And in some cultures, obviously it still is. And why have we kind of shied away from it in our culture? And how can we kind of bring some of that intentional reverence to this process, just like we do with any other part of being a human, you know?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I have one more question for you, but that's like my last ending question. Is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you wanted to share with folks?
Oh, that is a good question. But I think for me, it's not necessarily something we didn't talk about, but just this idea of really spending time with yourself and, as you're saying, being intentional about it and just truly, you know, it's made me, and again, I'm sure a lot of people right now just taking stock on like the experiences that shaped you and, you know, what are your values in life? What is important to you and how have you kind of implemented that? And I think that if people can spend some time kind of reflecting on those, just how, again, we'll go back to it, how rich that can help make your experience. And so I think just encouraging and excited is the word. And yeah, it does kind of sound weird to say that, but this excitement of just like getting to know yourself better and ask these bigger questions and hopefully have that kind of influence the way that you go about in your day to day.
Thank you so much for coming and talking and sharing your information, expertise.
So good to talk to you about all this. And it's just to have someone who I think we do come from a very similar place. And it's wonderful to be invited to start to have these conversations and get the word out about different things like this that I think, you know, people maybe even really want to talk about, but don't even know that they want to talk about. So I really appreciate kind of how you're using your platform for sure.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it matters. It's a big deal. The more we can bring everything out into light, into the open, the better.